Well, let's keep moving along here. We're in chapter 17, Christian Losses and Expansion, our second lesson in this subsection of church history that we know of as medieval church history. I want to begin by reading a passage of Scripture that I think is maybe one that can set the tone. It's in 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning in verse 9. This is Paul's swan song. This is the last thing that he basically has to say, because tradition holds that the next day he was beheaded as a martyr for the faith. But he's given his last instructions here in 2 Timothy 4, beginning in verse 9. He says, "Be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me." Now watch this. "Having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, and Titus for Dalmatia." And then he talks about in verse 11, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful for me for ministry." Like Demas, the church at the beginning and throughout the medieval period, I believe, loved the world and began to depart, began to leave what it meant to become the church. The church became more and more, listen to this fine distinction, the church became more and more about the church than about Christ. The church became more and more about politics than about the Word of God. It was departing. It was drifting. And again, it didn't happen overnight. So what we want to talk about here is some losses, places where the church went afoul, and some expansions. You see the church expanding, of course, because the church is going afoul. Some of their expansions were not necessarily all that good spiritually. So what happened in the medieval period? A common misconception about the medieval period is that it was the Dark Ages and nothing happened. The whole world went to sleep. Now, in many ways, we could say that that sort of is true. I mean, many people, the vast majority of people in Europe probably never traveled, people say more than 50 miles, probably never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. They didn't know anybody outside of their village. Most people couldn't read, couldn't write. So yeah, in a lot of ways, things were tough there. But the idea that civilization went into a long winter hibernation is not true. A lot happened during this period. It was during this period that the great mass migration of people, the greatest mass migration of people in history took place. Though none of them were as grand as Rome, many civilizations rose and or fell during this period. Religion was on the move as well, and this is especially evident in the expansion of Islam. Not primarily in North Africa, but also into Europe. The church in the West, that's the Roman Church, which became the Roman Catholic Church, expanded as it continued to evangelize pagan barbarians, and then gained ground in Britain and in Scandinavian regions. Again, with the Britons, it wasn't so much to try to get pagans to follow Christ as it was to get Christians who weren't loyal to Rome to become loyal to Rome. The Eastern Church, which we know today as the Eastern Orthodox churches, they didn't expand as much, possibly because they were fighting for survival against the Muslims. They put on a big fight there you stop and think, if you look at a world map today, where is Constantinople? It is now modern-day Istanbul. That's in Turkey. Turkey is a pretty large country by European standards, a fairly large country, and yet it's Islamic now. I mean, it's very much Islamic. 99% Islamic, 0.03% Christian. So, and this was like the second wing of the church at the beginning of the medieval period. And we'll talk a little bit more about them. As a matter of fact, let's talk about them right now. Speaking of Islam, Islam was begun in 622 by a camel driver named Muhammad, who lived from 570 to 632. 7th century, he claimed, the religion began because he claimed he had some visions in 570, or he was born in 570. He had these visions. He was uneducated. It is said that he couldn't read nor write. He dictated them to one of his wives who could write, and she wrote them down. Again, this is tradition. one of the basic premises of Islam was that the other religions in the area were all wrong. What other religions? Well, the other religions were Judaism, Christianity, and Arabian paganism. By the way, what's on the top of a mosque? It's not a cross. What's up there? The moon, the crescent. A lot of people don't realize this. The predominant Arabian pagan religion of that day was about Allah, the god of the moon. So what Islam did is he made an amalgamation, a coming together of Judaism, of Christianity, and of these pagan religions. Islam claims to be the rightful heir of Judaism. A lot of people, again, don't realize this. They say that Ishmael was the true son of promise of Abraham, and that Isaac and the Jews stole what belonged to Ishmael. Yes, indeed, the Arabian people and all the people, Middle Eastern people, other than the Jews for the most part, are the descendants of Ishmael. Allah, by the way, is the Arabic word for God. Although we need to be very careful that we don't say, well, the God of the Bible and Allah are the same. No, because we understand that today Allah means the God of Islam, and it's not the same God at all, as we'll see. His teachings included that Jesus was a prophet, but he wasn't the ultimate prophet. Muhammad is the ultimate prophet. He also taught that everything in the Bible, the Christian Bible about Jesus, was perverted and changed. That's what you do. If you don't like the facts, just say they're not facts. But especially the myth about Jesus dying and rising again. Is anybody, can I get a witness? That's kind of important to Christianity. That's not true, because God would never have allowed this prophet to die like that. Oh, and by the way, he's certainly not God, according to Islam. His teachings were rejected, and in 622, he fled to Mecca. Now, you might recognize Mecca as being an important part of the Islamic religion. We'll get to this in a few moments, but one of the 5 pillars of the Islamic religion is that if you're able, because we realize some people are too far and don't have the money, but if you're able, all good Muslims should take at least one pilgrimage to Mecca at some time in their life. Why? Because Muhammad went there. But he didn't go there on a religious pilgrimage. He went fleeing for his life, because the people who he was preaching his new religion to in Medina said, "You're out of your mind, get out of here, we're going to kill you." So he left. He went to Mecca, then later on he gained more people, and then he came back and killed a bunch of people in Media. But that's, Medina, that's another story. Islam spread so much faster than Christianity did. So much faster. One reason why is because Christianity goes out with persuasion. Islam went out with the sword. Now, it's not to say that the church, I've said before, one of the biggest problems the church makes in church history is it picks up the sword. The church is not supposed to pick up the sword. So are there periods of time when the church has mistakenly picked up the sword and tried to use force? Yes, and it's wrong and it's not biblical. But Islam, it's not considered wrong. It's the right thing to do. If you tell people to convert, and if they don't convert, you have the right to kill them. That's a simplification of it, but you get the basic idea. 20 years after Muhammad's death, the area that was under the influence of Islam, in terms of square miles, was nearly as large as the entire Roman Empire. A different area, overlapping, yes, but somewhat different area. 70 years after Muhammad's death, nearly all of North Africa was solidly Muslim. North Africa, is that an important place? Yeah, it was solidly Christian. One of the greatest universities in the world, as a matter of fact, some people argue it was the greatest university in the world, was at Alexandria in Egypt. And that was where so many Christian scholars came out of. And then what about the other Augustine? We spoke about Augustine of Kent or of Canterbury in our last session. But what about Augustine of Hippo, the great St. Augustine? He was in North Africa. All of it became Islamic, even though it was formerly decidedly Christian. They eventually got all of Spain. We forget this. The Muslims held Spain until almost the year 1500. As a matter of fact, Robert Godfrey makes a joke, and he says they had it until 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But it is true. It was 1492 when the Spaniards began to get rid of the Arabic and the Muslim religion. However, they were there for hundreds of years. A lot of people don't realize that so many things that we think of as Spanish, they're not Spanish at all. They're Moorish. They're Islamic. They're Muslim North African. As a matter of fact, the language, many words that are thought of as Spanish words today, what's one of the most common words, not only for daughters, but even for sons, but primarily for daughters, for Hispanic people, especially Mexican people, to name their daughters either first name or middle name at least, is Guadalupe. Well, Guadalupe, why is that so revered? Well, because there was allegedly an apparition of the Virgin Mary in a place called Guadalupe and whatever. Guadalupe is not even a Spanish word. It's an Arabic word. We learned this in an interesting way. I'll tell you a quick story. Francis and I were roaming around North Africa some years ago, and we went to a museum, and we saw something that said Guadalupe. And Francis says, oh, that's my middle name. And our friends that we met there, we didn't know them until we were on a train for a couple of days with these young Muslim students who were fascinated to practice English with us. She says, that's a Spanish word. And they go, no, it's not. That's an Arabic word. Guadalupe is an Arabic word? Yeah, it means Valley of the Wolf. You want to see one of the most beautiful examples of Spanish architecture close to where we live here in Southern California? Go to Santa Barbara and look at the City Hall. The City Hall and the courthouse, absolutely beautiful. Oh, footnote, it's not Spanish. It's all Arabic. It's all Arabic. And if you go with someone, a docent who really knows their stuff, they can point out how many things are in that place that are all Islamic. So the Islam was making tremendous inroads into specifically Spain, but all over. When they got to Turkey, a little bit later, it took them a while to get there and to conquer it. In 1452, they took Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. And it was interesting to me, not just to me, it's interesting, it should be interesting to all of us. It's interesting that when the Muslims actually made it up into Turkey and overran Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, they said, oh, these people here, the religion of these people is pagan idolatry. This was the eastern wing of the church. Why did they say that? Because they saw these people bowing down and worshiping pictures, icons. When the Church of Jesus Christ, to the outsider, looks like we're a bunch of idolaters worshiping icons, something tells me we've lost our way. But that isn't the only thing. They said yes, and they're polytheists because they believe in a Trinity. No, we'd say no, you just don't understand the Trinity. So when they said no, you don't either, because, and this, I kid you not, the Muslims who came and invaded, they said these people worship a Trinity of three gods: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Mother Mary. They were casual observers and they saw people worshiping. What are you going to say? When an outsider looks at you and it's so obvious that you're worshiping pictures and worshiping Mary, you know what they say, if it looks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. That's kind of the way it was. During the Reformation, it's interesting, during the 1500s, one of the big questions of the reformers was they were trying to wrestle with who's the Antichrist. They couldn't make up their mind. Was the Antichrist the Pope, or was the Antichrist Islam and Muhammad? Because they saw them both as being such a problem. The religion of Islam, based mostly on the Quran, which is purported to be, claims to be, dictated or given to Muhammad directly by God in some visions, and it's 114 chapters. They're called surahs. They're disjointed. There's no narratives in it. We read our Bible and there's stories interspersed with teaching. This is just statements. It's like reading a whole book that, not that the content's the same, but that the feel of it would be like reading Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that kind of thing. It's just a lot of sayings. Now, of course, we realize that people who are not Christians say that the Bible is all contradictory. So, I give way here to Christians. When we look at the Quran, it's filled with contradictions. But, people say the same thing about us. What do they believe about God? They believe that God is transcendent, meaning he's other than, he's out there, he's distant, but he's not immanent. He certainly would never become a man. See, when you say that Islamic people, Muslims, and Christians worship the same God, no, we don't. No, we don't at all, because our God has a son from eternity who became a man and who died and rose for our sins. Their God does not have that. So it's not the same God. You see the point? See the point? Very important for us to understand this. God is great in Islam, but he's not good. God is great, but he's not necessarily good. He's sort of capricious. You never know what he's going to do. He's kind of a lone guy, does his own thing. They put a huge emphasis on the sovereignty of God, so much so that it's not what we would understand as biblical sovereignty, it's what we would understand as fatalism. God's going to do what he does, and what you do doesn't matter a bit. That's not true. What we do does matter a bit. It matters a lot, but it doesn't take away from God's sovereignty. They have a couple of basic rules which keep some people from joining the religion. You can't drink alcohol. I just think I'm going to be a Muslim, right? You can't eat pork. Definitely not going to be a Muslim if you can't eat pork, because I believe that pork is seriously something we should eat in great quantities, especially barbecued. The religion is based on 5 pillars. The 5 pillars of Islam. The first is confession, and the confession is very simple. It says there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's it. That's the first thing. That's the entryway. That's the profession of faith. The second thing is prayer. Muslims are to pray 5 times every day facing Mecca, and when you're in a country, hopefully we won't see it get this far here, but you never know. I'll never forget the first time that I was in a country where there's a lot of Muslims. We arrived in Tel Aviv very late at night, ate a huge dinner because they gave it to us, and went to bed. And we woke up very early in the morning to the call to prayer, because right across from our hotel was a mosque with and this is what they're doing. And the call to prayer 5 times a day. Third pillar is to give alms to the poor. Not a bad thing. Be charitable. They're not called to tithe. They're called to give a fifth, not a tenth. Wait a minute. A 20th, not a 10th. Excuse me. I got to go in the right direction here. Fasting, which you have to fast for a month during Ramadan, but they got the fasting thing down in pretty cool ways. You just can't eat during the daylight hours, and during Ramadan, and this is true, I'm not throwing stones, you can't eat during the daylight hours, but during the month of Ramadan, you feast every night, if you can afford it. Obviously, poor people wouldn't, but it's a month of feasting and partying every night because you fasted all day. It just helps you get humble. And lastly, you take a pilgrimage to Mecca if you can, because you want to be like Muhammad, so whatever. One last note, Robert Godfrey points this out, and I think it's quite interesting. Women in Islam are of a lower caste. There's just no way around it. Men can have 4 wives. Women can only have 1, and some people say, and that's a blessing to have 4 wives? I'm thinking 1 is plenty. And maybe the wives have it better there, that they only have to listen to 1 idiot instead of 4. But men can divorce their wives for virtually no reason whatsoever, whereas women in modern day, maybe a little bit, but it's scarcely can an Islamic woman divorce her husband. Of course, women need to be veiled. I don't know if you caught the news, big news in this last week, that women in Saudi Arabia are going to be able to drive. I hope they take the thing off their eyes before they do, because it's helpful to see at certain times of the day and whatever. It's very interesting to think about all these things, but it's good for us to know something about Islam because it's a part of our world today. Back to what's going on in the church. The Eastern Church's struggle for survival allowed the Western Church to strengthen its position over the Eastern Church. So the Roman Catholic Church has been and continues to be stronger than Eastern Orthodox churches. The church in the West did oppose Islam and was involved in the Crusades to try to win back the Holy Land during this period of time. But the endeavor of the Crusades never ultimately succeeded. In addition, the Western Church was actively engaged in missionary activities, so there was some expansion going on. And at the same time, their struggle against Islam didn't work very well, because Spain is a pretty big country and it was completely overrun. The first evangelization of the British Isles, which we talked about in the last session, but real briefly again, took place in the 1st century. There was Christians there in the 1st century. It's hard to imagine. But if you remember in Romans, Paul makes reference to the fact, now I'm not saying he got there, but he made reference to the fact that he wanted to go to Tarshish. Tarshish is Spain and beyond. And so somebody got there. The Celtic Church was virtually on its own. It was out west. It was disconnected from what was going on with the Roman Church. The Celtic Church took a terrible beating from the invading Anglo-Saxons in the early 5th century, from 432 to 460. St. Patrick labored to evangelize Ireland for the Celtic cause. In 593, Scotland was evangelized by Columba. Patrick and Columba were Celtic Christians. They were not Roman. They were not Roman Catholics. It's interesting how St. Patrick is, he's like a big deal in the Catholic Church, and you wear green, and, you can eat, pickled meat. What is it called again? Corned beef, thank you very much. A little sidelight that's funny. What happens if St. Patrick's Day falls during the time of Lent? What happens if St. Patrick's Day falls on a Friday during the time of Lent? I kid you not, the Roman Catholic Church in the next town over gave the Knights of Columbus, which is a men's group in the Catholic Church, a special dispensation to say you can, because you're not allowed to eat meat during that time. They got a special piece of paper saying, yes, you can eat meat for St. Patrick's Day. I mean, is it a sin to eat meat? Who cares if it? See, this is religion at its zenith of lunacy. At the same time, Pope Gregory I, remember him, he wanted the British Christians to be subject to Rome, so he commissioned Augustine, who was a Roman Catholic, to go over there and evangelize them. By 663, the church in Britain was subject to Rome. And they were for a lot of years, until who? King Henry VIII goes, forget this. I want to be king and I want to be pope. I want to be king and pope. So he did. He had his own religion. If you notice on your book there's a little timeline there. We won't go over that. It's pretty obvious. The church was active in evangelizing in Germany as well. Some of you may recognize the name Boniface. He was a good man and was instrumental in this area of the Teutonic people or the Germanic people. His strategy is questionable under his leadership. When a leader was converted, Boniface said, okay, the whole country is now Christian. As a matter of fact, one of the ways that they would baptize people in some of these things is they would go in an arch, and there's little arches where people, an intersection of roads, and one goes over and one goes under. They would have some priests stand on the top of the arch and have all the people walk underneath and just sprinkle water as they went through, and that was their baptism. It's just a very spiritual moment for all of those people. What are we doing this for? Because the king changed religions. Well, that was how Boniface and his folks kind of did that kind of thing. Whole tribes and nations were baptized with little or no knowledge of Christ at all. I'm laughing, but it's sad. You see what I'm saying? There's expansion, but there's great losses because the church is expanding, but it's not the church anymore. It's turning into something else. The goal seems to have been as much a matter of winning loyal subjects to the Bishop of Rome as to the Lordship of Christ. And there's a little side note there that Boniface used women as missionaries. No one else did that. So, hip, hip, hooray for the women's movement under Boniface. And it is another interesting footnote that nowadays, when you go to the foreign mission field, there are tons and tons of women, single women, who are out there, true missionaries. There's a need for political evangelism in Rome's own backyard. The Lombards, we'll get more into this in the next session. The Lombards who accepted the Iranian aberration, these are the ones who said not Iran, but Arian, of saying we don't believe in the deity of Christ. That was that heresy. They settled in southern Italy. They refused to honor the Pope. They're right there in Italy, so we're not going to honor him. This was during the time of Gregory I. Guess what? He didn't like people who didn't want to recognize him as Pope. He was the supreme leader of the whole church. In 610, Pope Gregory dispatched a monk named Columbanus to the scene. He was able to persuade the people to renounce Arianism. That's a good thing. And recognize the Bishop of Rome as the leader of the church. Not such a good thing. Spain was another matter that didn't end as happily. As we mentioned before, this Christians in Spain had also accepted the Arian aberration of Christianity. When the leaders there were persuaded to renounce the Arian error, not all people followed. The ensuing internal conflict over which type of Christianity to embrace made Spain an easy target for guess who? Muslims. They just walked right in because the church was not united even on who Jesus Christ was. Very, very sad. The conclusion of the matter, in the 210 years from 590 to 800, the Eastern Church accomplished very little and ended up being paralyzed by Islam. The Western Church was able to cement for itself a broader political base, meaning people loyal to the Bishop of Rome. Although Spain had been overrun by Muslims in the 700s, virtually all of Western European Christians were subject to the Roman papacy by 800. So, expansion? Yes. But great losses spiritually. Great losses. We'll continue next time.